Axis and Allies Tips. The Tactics and Ideas for Powerful Strategy. Part 3. Links to Part 1 and Part 2 of this series will be in the description. Let's continue with have a game plan. One of my top tips for newer players is, as simple as it sounds, to have a long-term plan and one major objective to focus on, which as a rule of thumb should be to incapacitate one of your major enemies and capture their capital. To officially win the game, you need to capture a set number of victory cities, which will be easier to do in the part of the map where you have your enemy on the run. If you go into the game without a plan, your play is going to lack purpose. And while it's tempting to try and take over the whole world, realistically you're not going to be able to dominate every part of the map. You'll just end up being spread too thin. To be everywhere is to be nowhere. So my recommendation, as a rule of thumb, is to pick one of your enemies and thrust the bulk of your forces in their direction, using teamwork of multiple nations wherever viable to bully them into submission. I'm not saying ignore every other part of the map. You will have to take the fight to secondary theatres of war, but if you spread out too much, you might find yourself getting bogged down everywhere and making little meaningful progress anywhere. Here's an example of a game plan, one I would recommend to a newer player, and these principles will work in any of the main World War II versions. As the Axis, go for a kill Russia first strategy. Germany, after the almost mandatory attacks against the British Navy, should send as much possible eastward, purchasing infantry and artillery in the first few rounds, then tanks, and then planes. And ideally, this should be coordinated in such a way that they all reach Moscow at the same time for the big siege. Speed and efficiency is key, because soon enough you may find the British and Americans knocking on your back door in France, in which case you'll need to build up a defensive force to repel them. The aim is to take Moscow before turning to face the Western Allies. A secondary Africa campaign would be nice, but diverting resources here will initially blunt your attack towards Russia, because your Mediterranean fleet, which is essential for an Africa campaign, may not survive long unless precious resources are spent to defend it. However, if you can take Egypt and subsequently the rest of Africa, that's a lot of extra money you could be making. Meanwhile, Japan helps the cause by pushing into the Soviet Far East. This, however, is not their main focus. Japan's focus is the capture of Calcutta, which should be possible with a swift and efficient concentrated effort. Once there, Japan can use the factory, or build a new one, to build up some forces to hit Moscow in a 1-2 punch should the German onslaught fail. Spare bombers could be used to strategically bomb Russia to help weaken them in the lead up to the attack. Controlling this area will also make it much easier to defend the Money Islands, which are essential to maintaining a healthy Japanese economy. After a few rounds, the US will likely start making waves in the Pacific, so Calcutta needs to be taken as quickly as possible so Japan can turn and face the US with long-term plans to destroy their fleet and take the Hawaiian Islands. The Allies, on the other hand, should go for a kill Germany first strategy, because it's the Axis power that the UK, USA and Russia can most easily work together to defeat. As Russia, your goal should simply be not to die. Build up a huge army, mostly infantry, stall the Germans wherever you can on their advance, and dig in anticipation of a big siege. Of course, if Germany doesn't appear to be focusing on the Eastern Front, then building up some offensive equipment and eventually making a push is an idea, but one to be executed with caution, remembering that Germany's economy is often nearly twice that of Russia's. As the UK, you're going to want to threaten landings in France as soon as possible to put that pressure on Germany and divert forces away from Russia. You'll probably need to rebuild your Royal Navy to defend your transports, just enough to prevent the German Air Force from attacking it. You can also land some troops in Norway early on in the game to steal a few IPCs. If you have a factory in India, do build up some troops there, but focus mainly on building up a landing force to hit France. The UK can also fly fighters over to Russia to help defend it. The USA should spend 80% or more of its money on the European side, building up a fleet of transports and warships. Remember that the USA and UK can defend together, so build only as many warships as you need to protect against the German Air Force, and then focus on transports and ground troops. The US can either drop off these troops in the UK or land them in North Africa. North Africa is nice because from there you'll threaten both Italy and France, meaning the Germans may have to spread out to defend both. But it will also mean the UK and the US navies are divided and therefore potentially more vulnerable to German air attacks. When the time comes, the UK and the USA will smash into Europe one after the other, hopefully taking and holding France, crippling Germany, and eventually taking her capital. There's 100 things that can happen in a game. They say no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Things do go wrong, and you never know what your enemy is going to do, what their plan is, and how that will affect yours. Furthermore, in Axis and Allies, no plan is guaranteed to survive any contact with the dice. You will lose battles that were 95% in your favour. Sometimes no amount of planning and strategy can get past bad dice rolling. The key is to be fluid and adapt as the situation unfolds. Even so, with a game plan firmly in mind, your play will be focused and purposeful, and therefore much more likely to be successful. With a game plan in mind, you can start planning a set of specific opening moves to get your plan in motion. Emphasis on the word specific. While a game plan can be more vague and flexible, an opening repertoire should be exact and precise and planned down to the T. The beginning of the game is the only time you're going to know exactly where all of the units are going to be. If you're one of the first powers to go, you can really use this to your advantage. Your opening repertoire should take you through the first 2 or 3 rounds, after which point it will be impossible to know what the situation will be, but hopefully you'll have made an efficient and effective thrust in the direction of your overall goal, and you'll know what needs to be done from there on out. It is really important to get the first few turns right, because a poorly executed opening can set you up for failure from the get-go. To help you develop your own opening repertoire, I recommend downloading AAA, which is a program that lets you play Axis and Allies on your computer for free. I've used it many times to develop and practice an opening set of moves. I usually play the first 3 or 4 rounds only. This gives me an idea of how solid my opening moves are, allows me to visualize how my plan will unfold, and helps me identify where tweaks can be made so that I'm squeezing as much efficiency out of my starting income and units as possible. Through a process of trial and error over multiple games, eventually I settle on a solid opening I'm happy with, at which point I write all of these moves down, ready for my game. AAA is clunky and outdated, and it takes some time to get used to, but it's free and an invaluable tool to help you practice and get better at Axis and Allies. Plus there's no setup, which is nice. You can use it to play against the AI, and you can also use it to play by email against other humans. If you need some inspiration for opening strategies, there's a lot of ideas posted by fans on BoardGameGeek and AxisandAllies.org, which you can find if you do some digging.
Das war ein Befehl!
There is a lot to think about when it comes to your turn. Which units should you buy? Where should you attack? Where do you need to defend? What positioning will be optimal for you with the next turn in mind? Each turn must be completed in this set order, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend thinking in this order. I recommend considering what attacks you'll be making first, and then try and picture what the board will look like after your attacks have been completed, so that you know where your remaining units will be moving in the non-combat phase. I've found working backwards like this helps me to estimate losses and anticipate my enemy's next moves, which helps me figure out which units I'll need to purchase for the future. Remember, you're not buying units you need now, you're buying units you'll need at the start of your next turn. A common tactic I almost forgot to include in this series is the shuck-shuck maneuver. This is when transports move back and forth between two sea zones, offloading units each time. This strategy is commonly used by the US player between their mainland and either North Africa or the UK. And if two groups of transports are created, a constant stream of invading units will follow. In some versions of the game, like the 1942 second edition, establishing a shuck between the US mainland and the UK can be tricky because they're 3 spaces apart, and therefore it would take the transports 2 turns to get there. But what you can do is use Canada to get a more efficient shuck going. This animation will hopefully demonstrate this better than I can explain. Figuring out exactly how many troops you need to fill a set number of transports can be a bit of a headache, especially when you've got new transports getting built, existing transports returning to shore, and existing troops waiting to board. But I believe it's worth taking the time to figure out so that you can squeeze as much efficiency out of your build as possible. Ideally, you don't want half-empty transports, nor do you want to build too many troops so that you end up having to leave some behind. It's pretty easy once you get the hang of it, but I remember struggling to wrap my head around it during my first few games. And this is because you will need to buy transport troops at the start of your turn before you get to move anything else. The best advice I can give to help is, firstly, determine how many transports you will have at the coast by the end of your turn. For every transport you have, you will need 1 infantry and 1 of any other land unit. So if we've got 5 transports, we'll need 5 infantry plus any 5 land units. If we've already got some land units waiting, then we can subtract these from this total. Don't forget that you can always take these AA guns with you as well. Also, feel free to stack units in any way you want to help you see what's going on. Even now, if I have 5 transports to deal with, I'll have 5 infantry units in one stack, and then the any other 5 units in a separate stack. I've also been known to stack them like this before. Whatever helps you, do it. A few final tips. Firstly, watch and learn. There's a ton of games that have been played on YouTube. I've picked up quite a few tips and tricks by watching others play. Secondly, if your game takes a turn for the worse and victory is looking impossible, it probably is. So you might as well try something crazy, even if the odds don't favour you, because you never know. You could try something sneaky like taking Tokyo with a lone transport. I actually know an idiot that fell for that once. Don't be afraid to lose. If you do, remember, you can always blame the dice. Also, go on the axisandallies.org forums and have a browse around. There's loads of great content on there. You can search for things like 1942 second edition German opening strategy, and there'll be a ton of ideas and discussions waiting for you. And one final bonus tip: read the rulebook. So there you have it. I hope these tips will help you kick some ass in your next game. Thanks for watching.